Hayley works for Gensler, but she has previously done quite a lot of work for CABE and for DCLG on issues of density and housing design. She now works more internationally, and she was telling me how she was working on high density schemes in completely different contexts in the Middle East. So, Hayley.
Good morning. Firstly, I'd agree with Dickon that certainly it's actually not about density at all. It's actually about generating that critical mass of people in a well-designed environment that supports the urban services that we would expect and need within fairly close proximity, within walkable or cyclable distance to our homes. And that it's really about a range of building types. It can mean anything from 4-storey, 3-storey converted flats to the super densities that Dickon was talking about, and that really it's about the site, the context of a development, a high density development is critical, and there's no standard formulae or way of laying out a particular site, although there are guidelines which I'm going to go through as well in terms of how I lay out sites when I do higher density developments. In terms of measuring site net density, I use a range of different techniques to do that, but in order to first define the site that I'm going to look at, and I'll come on to the exact measurements that I use, and they're probably actually to do with the ones Dickon are talking about occupancy, about space standards per person, things like that. I'd normally identify the access roads within the site, private garden space, car parking, incidental open space and landscaping, but exclude the major distributor roads and primary schools and secondary schools. And there's quite a lot of debate that happens, and certainly in the research that I've undertaken, about defining whether to include or exclude large open spaces, whether they serve that particular development, and if they do, then to include it, but if they don't, they actually serve a wider area to exclude them, and also exclude significant landscape buffer strips where they occur, say for example along infrastructure corridors. Now the standard one that's typically used, of course, is the dwelling units per hectare, but this gives us no idea really about what a place could be like and what impact it would have on the existing residents and on new residents. And I think actually in mixed use higher density developments, which particularly we're seeing a lot more of now, I would agree that plot ratios are actually more appropriate, and that people per hectare, and comparing that to the amount of the volume of space and floor area per person is actually much more important. So there, I mean, I'm sure you've all seen it before, the range of typical densities that we see in the UK, and I've just standardised them, dwellings per hectare, because it's the people per hectare is quite a bit of a different picture actually. Typically, probably the density that I would prefer, the people tend to prefer, would be the mixed densities across a site. So the terraces with semi-detached and detached houses and apartments mixed into a development. Of course, this depends on the size of site that you're looking at, and that density gradients across the site are quite important in terms of creating a kind of development that is both acceptable to existing residents but also is something that is desirable for new residents locating into a development. In terms of the benefits of density, I mean, of course there are negatives, but there are a number of benefits that I would like to highlight, which is the social proximity in terms of encouraging interaction between people and improving viability of and access to community services. Just, more people makes a dentist or a doctor more viable in that particular location. And can, in certain situations, depending on the design factors and the context of the site, enhance the economic viability of the development itself and give you economies of providing infrastructure. It's fairly obvious in terms of the transportation argument, in terms of supporting public transport and starting to improve the viability of different options of providing car parking on a site, because as Dickens says, we do all would like, you know, at least one car parking space per unit, and so starting to play around with the density of a development means that perhaps undercroft or basement parking can start to become economically viable. In terms of, it gives you much more of an opportunity to increase the energy efficiency of a particular development, but also I think that that's related to the density that you want to have in terms of the number of people and things like that. There are just some of the key concerns in the research that we undertook, and they're all fairly familiar to you all, and probably in the research that we undertook, the key one was the impact on traffic and car parking, which is why getting that car parking design correct and getting the level per apartment correct is so critical. And local residents' opposition frequently around the argument about out of character with the particular area, which is why context is so important, and the level of density proposed on a particular site. There's also the negative association with problem families in high density, and that may be a historic one, but now with the I guess the prevalence of 1 and 2 bed flats in the buy-to-let market, actually it's not necessarily problem families, it's problem tenants. And in developments where you get a very large proportion of buy-to-let flats, this is where the management regime and even the sales regime actually starts to become quite important to consider at the start to avoid those particular issues. Now, if you ask the average person on the street, you know, well, how many dwellings per hectare do you think are in your neighbourhood? You know, no one would really have an idea. And it is, the perception of density is actually driven by design and environmental clues. Can I find a car park at night when I come home? Are there always children hanging out on the street intimidating me, and things like that? And it's actually the neighbourhood characteristics, you know, high crime levels, low crime levels, good health facilities, retail close by, that actually is the significant choice factor rather than what density it is. And so in designing higher density developments and assessing them, of course the surrounding neighbourhood is critical in terms of getting acceptance for that particular development. And it seems to be conditional upon meeting existing residents' concerns in terms of, will this, you know, what's the profile of the people who will live here? You know, are they similar to me in a way almost? You know, is it going to overload the doctors? You know, will I be able to get an NHS dentist because there's a whole lot of new residents coming in? And in terms of looking at the future occupants, really they're looking at, is this development in a good location? Is it well constructed and designed? What are the space standards like? You know, as Dickens said, can I fit my furniture in, and can I rearrange it from time to time? In terms of the work that we've done in Europe and elsewhere, you know, high density living can be successful for all household types, and it's about getting that mix right, and it's about designing it correctly in the first place. But also related to that is the profile of residents who are going to move in, and a key density issue is that level of occupation during the day and at different times of the day as well, and the amount of time that people will spend at home, and that's a critical factor when designing things like, you know, the level of open space provision, access to particular facilities, and so on. And as we all know, families can live successfully in higher density schemes, but as Dickens identifies, at very high densities, of course, they do tend to work best with a higher proportion of adult residents who are gone for much of the day while they're out at work. And so that when we're looking at schemes which incorporate family accommodation, actually the density needs to come down because the intensity of use is much higher. And so there's the standard advice on actually how do you start to design medium-rise and high-rise buildings. So trying to maximise density while minimising that perceived intensity and overcrowding. So in terms of designing the actual developments themselves and assessing them, it's all about starting to look at the street becoming the central organising element of the development itself, and providing a strong block structure in order to clearly define both private spaces, communal spaces and public spaces, but also to start to avoid problems of overlooking and privacy issues as well. And I know in the work that I'm doing at the moment in the Middle East, actually the number one concern is the privacy issue and being able to see into somebody else's apartment, and it's sort of the main thing that they seem to identify there. Perimeter blocks, of course, being the most flexible and adaptable, and they provide quite a consistent, easily legible urban grain. As I said before, using density gradients is critical, and also this can start to work on larger sites. You can then reduce the density of the development as you come towards the edges of the site in order to try and allay existing residents' concerns about the higher density development. In terms of laying out particular developments, it's about looking at what are the existing desire lines on the site, where would potential future desire lines to public transport facilities and to key local services. How can we introduce frequent access points into and through the development itself so that it becomes well knitted into the existing urban framework. And starting to develop a hierarchy of streets and routes and spaces, and then defining those through the building form itself, which allows you to easily orient yourself on foot and by car through a development and start to avoid concentration of traffic on particular routes. And of course then laying over the top of that pedestrian routes, making sure that they're safe and secure in terms of observed, and cycle routes connected into existing cycle routes so that you get a continuity of cycle facilities and throughout the development. And there's probably one of the best examples of sort of medium density streets we found, which is a typical home zone or Woolnerf. So, as I said before, car parking is probably the most contentious issue that I've come across for higher density housing, and secure car parking as well. And the most successful ones that we found often had underground car parking garages with fairly sophisticated entry systems. But also this was supported by easily accessible cycle storage and secure cycle storage facilities within the curtilage of the building itself. In effect, trying to make it easier for you to use your bicycle than it was to use your car. And also there's a difference between car storage and car parking as well. And found that people needed to recognise that actually, no one could be home, but yet the development could be full of cars, because a lot of people would be using the easily accessible public transport or cycle routes or walking to work or to the shops. But actually they kept their car for rare journeys that they would make, to visit grandma or whatever. And so that there needed to be a recognition in the design process that there was this difference between car storage and car parking for more regular use. So the higher the density, obviously the more important open space provision is, and that the landscaping needed to be well managed, needed to be well thought out, and that there needed to be a clear delineation between private space, so looking to provide patios and large balconies, which of course are large enough for a whole family to sit out and dine on and not used as storage places, becomes much more important. And that the successful developments that we looked at were frequently designed around a very strong landscape vision, and the landscape itself was a critical part, and the management of that landscape, consistent management, was very important to their success. And so there needed to be a very clear delineation between the different types of open space, and that the boundary between private and public open space needed to be well screened to ensure that in particular ground floor apartments or duplex units actually felt private when you were within that private space. And I'd reiterate the point that Dicker made about balconies being sufficiently large to be able to dine out on, and they needed to be oriented for the sun. And interestingly, in a lot of the Scandinavian developments we looked at, the balcony was quite often not off the living room. It was actually might have been off a bedroom, and that was because they were positioned for maximum solar gain, so that they would be used because they weren't in shadow for most of the day. And it's critical that you provide sufficient storage space within the unit itself, and if necessary, a lot of successful developments supplemented that with basement storage lockers that were available for large or bulky items to avoid them being stored, an old washing machine stored on the balcony, things like that. And then providing sufficient cycle storage space as well, so that bicycles weren't placed on balconies, which also resolved the problem of mud being tracked through common parts as well, because it was not being left on a balcony. The size of the unit becomes so much more important when looking at higher density development, and it's particular not just the floor area per person or per unit. It's actually the ceiling height, it's the size of windows, so that you're creating a feeling of light and space within the unit. So you may be inside it, but you wouldn't know necessarily that this is a higher density development. And in particular, also, it's important the number of units that share a single entrance, a number of units per floor as well. And typically, the ones that we looked at were ranging between per floor 4 to 12 units per floor, depending on the size of unit as well. Oral privacy is almost as important actually as visual privacy in the successful developments that we've looked at, and particularly this horizontal noise transition between party walls. The most successful developments, the way in which they laid out the units, so having a living room, actually making sure that the living room was not adjacent to the next unit's bedroom, for example, was really important in making sure that you didn't get this translation of noise between units. And so making two noisy uses, so living rooms and kitchens, next to each other in a layout worked much more successfully. The management is almost actually as important as getting the design right, and in terms of getting agreed standards of behaviour and acceptable standards of behaviour and between residents and engendering a feeling of community is quite critical, and that's something that actually you need to consider or have a review of right at the start of the design phase. And as Dickon highlighted, the service charges issue is critical in looking at the affordability issue, and integrated refuse collection and recycling. And I think that this image actually is one of the most beautiful refuse collection points I've seen in developments that we looked at. And the value issue is also critical as well, in that there is this perception that very high densities do decrease value. They actually can increase build costs, and that is something that needs to be recognised. And there is then a difficulty in order to differences in expectations. What I've also done, and I can provide this to you all, is just a quick checklist that we developed, which looks at a number of things of an aide-memoire when looking at a higher density development. And it's things like, is there a design champion for the project? Has the design of your unit taken account of occupancy levels at different times of the day? Is there a sort of very strong open space strategy? Is there a landscape vision? How is the design of internal external roads going to impact on private car use? It just goes through, looks at checking out, sunlight and daylight, the microclimate issues. And interestingly, the work that we're doing in the Middle East is the total opposite. There, you want to design for shading, you want to design for wind creation, and it's quite interesting. It's the total opposite sort of way of looking at urban design. Thank you.
Thank you very much.